Probably I have a ice-breaking question already to start. I was wondering, in this whole state fragility, you didn't go too much into the question of democracy. Do you think that democracy is a kind of a precondition, or do you think you can get out of state fragility by remaining kind of an authoritarian regime, but just more efficient? This would be my question. Would you like to answer immediately, or should we gather 2 or 3 others? Let's gather 2 others.
I'll write it down. I will not have a good answer, but yes.
Yeah. Please, yeah.
What is the responsibility of the international community in all of these conflicts? It means to what extent should or the EU, the United States, the international community involve themselves into solving these conflicts? Does it mean that when the conflict is solved, can the international community just leave and never come back, or should we keep presence, and should we make sure that we keep on investing into the economy, into decreasing the social economic inequalities in order to prevent from the problem of violence to come back?
Yeah.
Good question, yeah.
Very good question. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so often women and young people are excluded from the peace-building process. So my question was, how do we include them more, and why do we?
Yeah. Maybe I'll.
Yeah, maybe let's make a small break here and you answer, and then we get...
Oh, I wish this works? Does this work?
Yes.
Yeah, good. So I wish I had good answers. If only I had the answers, especially to what is the responsibility of the international community. We can talk for hours about it. I'll start with the democracy question. And the answer is, I think it depends what we mean, right? So, okay, first I'll actually give the straight answer. My 2 cents is to have a sustainable stability, you have to have some level of political representation and legitimacy. So then the question is, can you have a situation of where population feel the government is legitimate and representative without it being a democracy? Empirically, that's an academic question. Empirically, I am not convinced. Do you need a Western-style liberal democracy? No, not necessarily. Do you need some elements of representation, basic check and balances, a system that guarantees basic dignity and rights to its citizens? I would feel strongly that that's the case. But it is a question. It is a question, and I think it's going to be a question that we are going to have to deal more and more with, because now I'm switching a little bit to the strategic side, but for many years there was basically one main donor, that was Europe and the United States, providing foreign assistance to developing countries, and often providing this type of assistance on the basis of conditionality, which is very much the way, for example, the EU still does it, right? So if you want to access these particular funds, you have to do A, B, and C, and at times A includes political reforms, democratization, maybe not always, but let's say at least there is an element of conditionality and reform. There are now new donors on the market that do not require conditionality. China is a great example. China is making great strides in working with developing countries, for example, in Africa, and they provide exactly that model. What they're saying is we have an outstanding record in lifting people out of poverty, which they do, and we do so without the messiness of democracy and representation and human rights. And to some governments, that's very attractive. I am quite worried about that, the impact of that on our international order, on the rule-based international order, on the achievements that were made when it comes to human rights. But that is the reality. And that means that from the policy side, you need to really be better at articulating the narrative and why your model is better, if it is. And you need to really look at it quite carefully in a way that maybe we weren't challenged to do in the past. So I think that's a key question. On the responsibility on the international community, I don't have an answer. This is not, this is the, but I will instead reframe it and say, I believe that, let's take it for European security. I believe that our security is indivisible with that of our near neighborhood. So if our southern neighborhood is engulfed in internal conflict and fragility, we can ignore it. We can build a wall, whatever you want. I don't think it's going to work. So my argument would be, it is in our interest to work with these countries because our security is indivisible and interrelated. And I think it's not bad to phrase things through the prism of interest, because I have looked quite carefully at patterns of external intervention in the past, and it's very difficult to have the long-term commitment that you need if you don't have at least some stake in the game. In other words, states are not particularly altruistic. So they may be able to help for a little bit, but then if something more important, an emergency comes along, they may actually divert the resources. And that can be more destabilizing than not having been involved at all. So I would caution. So that's why I believe that it's very important to be quite careful in how and when to become involved. And when you do, then you should be in there for the long haul. And I believe you can only do that when you're involved in a scenario that has direct implications for your security or your personal or your interest as well. I mean, it may be a little bit not idealistic, but I think that is the reality. And I think if you look at empirics, that is the case. When international community gets involved without any type of real interest, eventually it leaves, and it might not be at the right time. So, women and youth, right? So the why, it's because I think, the why is because a lot of the peace processes that we see are very top-down. So they're very elite-driven, and that means that normally that's a code word for, depending which part of the world you are, white men in suits, or maybe not in suits, but that's what a code word for elite-driven is in many places. And that tends to power reproduces power, so they tend to, when they think at what is a representative system, it's one that looks like them. And then you have not just women and youth, but minorities and a lot of other voices that are excluded from the process. I think, again, and I'm a little bit of a broken record, the case I would make, and the one I make, is that broadening the conversation, it's not something that it's nice to do, but it's something that is in our interest. Because we know from the literature and we know from case studies that actually peace processes work better when they're more inclusive, and they work better when they have more potential champions of change. So my case would be just reproducing structures of power and letting marginalized voices out is not just not particularly nice, it's also not particularly smart, because long term you need as many allies as you can gather if you want to transform a society. So I would make a desperate plea in those cases to involve more women, more youth, and more our represented voices. But oftentimes it's about who gets to decide, and people tend to hire, want, reproduce themselves. So.
Okay, let's open up for you, Claire. Okay, let's have a few, going up slowly.
Thank you very much for painting the picture for me that is actually really clear. Yes, I'm really impressed by that. Thank you. My question is, so you explain how legitimacy, aside from capacity, is determining state fragility, and I was wondering, how do you face that actors, whether they are state or non-state ones, can then projects on this legitimacy, whether it's vertical or horizontal.
So how do you build that stability? How do you build that legitimacy?
I mean, how would you strategically face the fact that actors try to build on their legitimacy, whether it is true or not, on capacity? I mean, like on
Yeah.
information propaganda. Or
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your answer, Dave. I have a question on your, you said that China is not giving conditions. Asking conditions.
No, on human rights. On human rights.
Okay.
On other things it is. Yes.
Okay, what kind of other things are they asking?
Yeah.
Can we take a fourth one and then close this round? Yeah.
Peace building operations require a lot of actors and non-state actors to come from the international community. So like NGOs, NATO, and a lot of people whose jobs and livelihood depend on these peace building processes. So in the long term, how is the international community really interested in actually creating real change? Because why would I, want to lose my job ultimately if I work for the transport and it's paying me well to say that I'm actually helping people have a better state of life. And so there is a lot of political economy that goes behind this.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we should also be more open about it.
Okay.
And also when you say like, yeah, we could keep it in knowledge, okay, that's maybe not good for security, but I mean in the long term, sustaining this conflict situation is also in the interest of powerful countries like Europe. So how do you balance this?
Okay, thank you. So the thing, I'll start with the fragile fail. It's more a matter of degree. So the failed is either zero, it's more binary. It's either you're failed or not. Fragility is on a spectrum. So all states are fragile, to one level or another. I mean, including pick your EU member state situation, you can look at all the indicators and see, well, on this it scores a little bit lower. So all countries are on a spectrum of fragility, whereas failed is the extreme. So it would be at the very end of that fragility spectrum. And by talking about fragility instead of failure, you're really broadening the number of countries and situations you're looking about. You're not just looking at Somalia in '94. You're looking at a much broader set. So it's really about just more nuanced. How do you deal? Okay. Then there was. I feel like, this setting is a bit like an exam, and I hope I'm not failing, but these are very hard questions. On the legitimacy bit, yes, absolutely, because, all of these conflicts are about politics, and all of these groups are political animals at the end of the day. Not all, but all the groups we're talking about, those who bother to take control of territory and trying to govern, well, they want to be seen as legitimate. It's not a fluke. It's not by default that one of the first things ISIS would do when it would take over a village is to go in the municipal building, take down the flag, and put on their flag. Symbols matter. It's about wanting to be perceived as legitimate, wanting to be perceived as a state, denying the state while mimicking it, which is the contradiction that is very interesting from a more academic perspective. I'm afraid that you have to, how do you counter this? You have to have a more convincing narrative, I think, and you also have to be able to point out where their shortcomings are and do better, right? And that's a big challenge. You need to be able to say they're failing to do A, B, and C while saying that they're doing it, and our model is different and works. So, it's a lot of it is about political communication, but a lot of it is about the substance. And I think that sometimes some of my quarrels with some of the counter-narrative that we have developed to counter violent extremism over the years is that it focuses, in my opinion, maybe I'm completely wrong, but it focuses too much on the slogan and too little on the substance behind it. Meaning it's an exchange of messages, but we need to be able to back it up. So it's a short answer to a very difficult question. China's model. I wouldn't call it conditionality, but if you look at the case like Sri Lanka, I would call it a debt trap. So it's a very different approach. And the reason why that might be appealing to many governments is because many governments have absolutely no interest in political reforms towards more transparency, accountability on human rights. So that's all seen as a burden. And to come in and to have a model that comes with no strings attached when it comes to those political issues is something that can see very appealing. And I think China has been very clear that they do not believe in their idea of state sovereignty means no interference, means we don't get involved in how any state runs their own business. So.
Yeah, can I repeat on that? So, because I guess you use Sri Lanka as an example, but Sri Lanka now has a military basis from China, so they are not intervening in it.
I don't think we're I don't think I'm not arguing to accept. I'm not arguing that it's a better model. I think you need to be very wishful.
But why are they saying that they're not intervening when they're now putting a military base like really losing your?
I think I'm the last person to be the spokespersons for the PLA, but I would say from their point of view, what they would say is that this is with the government's agreement, and this is something that results in it's a financial transaction, so they wouldn't see it. I'm struggle a little bit to take that part, but I'm putting on that hat. But it is a different. I think the policy point is it is a different model that has been put out there, and there's a lot of people who are interested. So if you are working from the European side and having your model, it's a good time to think about how can you tackle that. That was more my point. And then the self-licking lollipop humanitarian industry question. Great question. The specific organization you mentioned, I've been working very closely with them in a situation like Syria. I would say, well, Médecins Sans Frontières was one of the only organizations that decided to work not through the government in Damascus and take pretty good personal risks to be able to operate, including in rebel-held area where very few other NGOs went. So I'm just saying some nice words about them because I think the work they do is quite outstanding. But in general, the point is well taken, and I think that's exactly the problem of and that's the problem of the long term. That's to one extent what I was saying about the issue of the long-term humanitarian assistance that becomes aid dependency, right? Because it's not geared, by definition, it's not geared towards leading towards self-sufficiency because it's emergency assistance. So emergency assistance is about taking care of a need that is imminent, critical, and urgent. And if you don't, people will die. That's basically it. The problem is if you do it over 10 years or longer, what you're creating is a very, I think, dysfunctional type of incentives and a very dysfunctional cycle that is difficult to break, where you have aid dependency and lack of sustainability. And if you find a way to square that circle, because the alternative to me would be not to, so the extreme alternative would be not to provide assistance, but then I would argue that that's not my preferred outcome. Let's put it that way. When I having this, the option of having a great humanitarian crisis with 1 million refugees and no one is stepping in to at least ensure that they have a shelter, to me that's not what I want to argue for. But at the same time, I think you are very right to say that we need to be critical about the way we do things. Of course, that's the solution is one in which you have a much more again, locally driven, where you employ more local, but it's not something that you're not gonna see a major change in the industry anytime soon, I'm afraid. So I'm unsatisfied in answering to a very good question. I think you're bang on the money on that, but the alternative is not necessarily better. The alternative would nobody does anything is not better.
I mean, it's a continuation of the colonial legacy, just in a new way. I mean, there is a certain
think that's a very
The white savior kind of burden. It's very much present in the humanitarianism. And so
I think that's a very intellectual. Intellectually, it's a nice argument, but in reality, I mean, okay, we're good. We could probably have a back and forth for an hour. I respect your I respect your point, and intellectually, I think it's really valid. In practice, I'm very uneasy with the practical consequences of saying not doing anything, and I also don't think it's our interest as an international community. But that would be an argument to make these processes more inclusive and to bring in more actors rather than not doing it, I would say. But, I may be wrong. What?
Okay. Should we have another last round of questions? Okay, please, yeah.
Yeah, I wondered about, you talked about stability, and I wonder what role civil society may play in, stability.
I have a question about a specific area. I feel like the Yemeni civil war has been considered kind of as a forgotten conflict, both by the media and by the international security actors. I wanted to know, according to you, why is that?
It's a little bit off topic because we're going to concern the failed state or the fragile state. But it's the same question that we asked before about the situation in China, for example, where state is repressing its part of the population. Maybe you can also answer some questions like why should someone who care about this, because the same argument is out there that it's good for our community more. And how can we legitimize that, and which actions can we actually do?
Okay, civil society. I mean, I think I would go very much along the same point I made when talking about inclusion of women and youth. But the point is, bringing more people at the table tends to be a good idea when you want to have an inclusive process, and having an inclusive process makes sense when it comes to having more players with stake in the game that will then work to implement it or to be champions of that agreement. So I think there's enough good practice that it makes sense to include civil society in these processes. I'm pausing and hesitating because we don't have a lot of time, but I would, if we did, and I would be tempted to have a conversation about what do we mean by civil society, who are the actors, how do we classify it, because that's again a civil society. That's again and often sometimes used as a catchy label that is very allows us to feel, well, I don't want to be too pessimistic here, but depending on the context, who we identify as civil society may or may not be. And the issue is in many countries, authoritarian governments have learned the game and have created their own civil society, which does not comply with what we believe civil society and one step back. When we talk about civil society, depending whether you're using, there's two main definitions, the traditional Tocqueville or Putnam. The point is whether you're using independent, not state control, civic association that foster this idea of civility. That's one. And then the more recent definition is all of that plus that acts as a counterweight to the state, as a watchdog. Whichever definition you choose, there's a lot of places where we go and interact with civil society, it's as none of the above, because it is actually very close to the state or because it is a government-controlled NGO. So, I mean, there would be a lot of reflections. Mm-hmm. So if we are talking about truly what civil society is, so independent, civilian voices, yes. If we're talking about checking the box, yes, we have civil society because we have two organizations recommended by the government, then maybe it's more about PR than substance. So I completely agree, but the way we do it sometimes is a little bit underwhelming because, of course, the problem in not free countries is that there is no freedom to have a civil society. There is, doesn't mean that people don't organize anyways, but it's much harder to actually reach those voices. So it's a challenge, but one we should pay more attention to. There's simply, it's tragically, I agree with you that this is a terrible conflict when it comes to humanitarian consequences that receive far too little attention. The long story short is because it's less geostrategically significant to our interest than in other places. I mean, I could give you any other answer, but that wouldn't be the reality. The reality is we pay more attention to conflicts that happen in areas that are key to our interest. And whether that's right or wrong, it's a different question. But I think that plays a lot, that plays a role in why Yemen hasn't been in the news as much. And also, I think that's reason number one. A parallel reason is that I think it's less, I mean, this is terrible, but I think it's the reality. It's less familiar to a lot of our audiences, so journalists cover it less as well, and as combination. Which should give us pause to reflect, but it is, I think that plays a role. I'm forgetting something that was really interesting. About China. There was more China. Oh, okay, I forgot it because it's too difficult. I don't have a good answer. So, I think it is in our interest to, imperfect as it is, to keep the international rule-based order. To reform it, to adapt it, to enlarge it, but I think it is in our interest to keep those basic rules that we have achieved over the past decades. And I think that would be a reason that's a reason why I would see no problem when the European, I'm talking personal perspective, when the European Union makes statements about China's observance to compliance with international law. It seems to me pretty natural if one of your key interests is to keep that order alive, because that order benefits you, and actually your entire system is built around the system of rule-based international order and multilateralism. You want to keep it. So then to speak out when states don't comply with it makes to me a lot of sense. Again, I go to the state interest base because I think that's something that drives states' behavior far more than anything else. So that would be my why it makes sense to speak about these issues. When it comes to internal human rights issues, as you know better than me, that within the EU that's a discussion, and you have different member states that want to go more far or less far when it comes to actually calling out internal human rights abuses. I think my opinion doesn't matter in that sense, but again, I go back to interest. If you have again, personal opinion, but if you have over the next decade the rise of a political model of techno-authoritarianism that is very, very effective at doing things like surveilling its own population, and that is very, very effective about exporting that technology to other countries, that is something that you should care about, because it also is to do about the way you organize your society and the way you want to and the way you want the rules of the international community to be like. So to me, there is a direct interest there too. But this is very contentious, and that's why I'm being unclear, because I'm literally walking on eggshells, and there is something recording me very ominously. So yes. So that's all I'm going to say.
Okay. Should we take another round, or I think it's?
If it's just one, it seems
Okay,
since it's one, yes.
Okay, one the final one.
My question is whether don't you think that the entire concept of state is a kind of Orientalist concept, and having said that, it means that sooner or later it includes the element of imposing the economic reconstruction based on the state, the neoliberal pattern of governance, which is very experimentatory in a way that favors really the strong
why I don't use the state building. That's why I don't talk about state building. Yes, that's, yeah. But I would, well, although it doesn't have to be, but I would say that if you're referring, yes, there's a lot of, there's definitely a big empirical evidence that has been state approach to state building in the past. I don't talk about state building. Very few people talk about state building, and the reason why is because I think if you take a good look at the international community today, you will find very little interest from the international community to do state building, which is really intensive, and that stabilization is much more nimble in its approach and in its angle. It's really about finding the areas where you can help speed the process along, rather than this whole all-encompassing state building apparatus, which is very difficult to do and very costly. And maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I see any particular country today being particularly geared towards undertaking these efforts in the near future. At least not in this overarching pattern.
The last example is our construction in Iraq, I think, I ended up in it for 5 years and spent and really have a backlash of resilience now and also problematic security.
But I don't think that should change the word reconstruction. I think we could perhaps agree that if you have a country that has been through a dire civil war, it cannot rebuild its own apparatus by itself without any type of assistance. It just simply can't. It doesn't work unless they have a few billions handy, which they don't. So then you have to think about how do you support reconstruction. The fact that you can do it according to different templates, sure, of course, I think you should.
Okay. Many thanks, Benedetta, again for a fascinating speech and a